Welcome everyone to the September All-America Cities Promising Practices webinar, Creating a Culture of Engagement, Tools and Practical Examples. My name is Rebecca Trout and I am the Director of the All-America Cities Award Program here at the National Civic League. The National Civic League is a 125-year-old nonprofit that aims to advance civic engagement to create equitable and thriving communities. The All-America City Award is our flagship program, and it began in 1949 to recognize exceptional civic engagement in local governments. We are actually now accepting letters of intent and applications for the 2020 All-America City Awards. This year, we will be recognizing 10 communities as All-America Cities for their inclusive civic engagement work that has fostered health and well-being in communities. To win, each community must demonstrate innovation, impact, equity and inclusiveness, civic engagement, and cross-sector collaboration by describing 3 successful efforts to address pressing local challenges around health and well-being. I'll be sending additional information if you're interested in applying for the All-America City Awards, and that will come via a post-webinar email. Please also note that this year's letters of intent are due a little bit early. They are due November 1st, and applications are due February 19th. Now, while the All-America City Awards celebrate great work through our awards program and competition, we also aim to share the innovative practices, initiatives, and projects around the country through avenues such as this monthly webinar series. So today, we will be providing tools and practical examples for communities to create a culture of engagement. First up, we have Doug Linkhart, President here at the National Civic League. Doug will be discussing our tool, the Civic Index. Following Doug, we will be joined by Cori Burbach, Assistant City Manager of Dubuque, Iowa, and Paul Duster, Director of Community Initiatives. Cori and Paul will share how they've been able to create a culture of engagement in Dubuque. If you have any questions during the presentations, please feel free to submit them via the chat box, and we'll have all of the presenters answer those questions at the very end of the webinar. So without further ado, Doug, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to everyone for joining us. We're glad to have you participating in the webinar. We're very proud of the Civic Index. It's something that was started 30 years ago by individuals at the National Civic League who were noticing a pattern as they worked with communities around the country in terms of a number of parameters that would make up a strong community. And so they put together the Civic Index back in 1986, and we're now on the 4th edition of the Civic Index. The Civic Index measures civic capital, and civic capital is the capacity of a community to solve problems and thrive. So it's essentially the informal and formal relationships within a community, the networks and capacities that those communities use to make decisions and solve problems. The history of the index has been connected with the All-America Cities program. As you know, the All-America Cities program started ago, and we've been using the Civic Index now as part of the All-America Cities program. And we can now say that communities designated as All-America Cities have strong civic capital and live up to the promises of the Civic Index as we've written it. So I'm going to go briefly through the 7 different components of the Civic Index that make up civic capital and give a few examples from each. The Civic Index is available on our website, and we'll be making it available. We'll be sending it out after this webinar to those who are participating. So there are 7 components of civic capital that we've identified over the years. I'll just say them briefly and then go through each one. Engaged residents, inclusive community leadership, collaborative institutions, embracing diversity and equity, authentic communication, culture of engagement, and shared vision and values. What we mean by engaged residents is that all residents are engaged in the community. All types of residents, whether they're homeowners or renters, whether they're citizens or non-citizens, that young people, old people, businesses, nonprofits are also considered stakeholders or members of the community. A community with engaged residents engages everyone in the community. An example of a community that does this is Hampton, Virginia, which has strong neighborhood groups. It has a neighborhood office that helps neighborhood organizations and residents create neighborhood plans. It operates a small neighborhood improvement grant program. Hampton also has a youth community center, and for several decades now has used a program called iValue for budget input. Every time there's a major budget decision or a bond issue or a mill levy, the community goes out to the residents and gets their input on those kinds of items. And it's paid off for Hampton. They've been able to cut budgets without a lot of complaints, and they've been able to increase taxes when they need to. Second component is inclusive community leadership. And this means not only formal leaders, but also informal leaders. If you've got an immigrant community, for example, that may not be engaged in your city politics, chances are that they have informal leaders that you may or may not be aware of. So it's a matter of identifying leaders and also developing new leadership. Leaders that might participate in formal programs like citizen academies or civic academies, but also informal leadership. For example, if the mayor has a monthly get-together with leaders from throughout the community, that helps to designate those individuals as leaders. Or if the mayor has connections with people in the community that he reaches out to for major decisions. An example is Beaverton, Oregon, which has a program called Beaverton Organizing and Leadership Development, BOLD. It's a multicultural, intergenerational program. It's a 3-day leadership development program. And they identify people, particularly in underrepresented communities, immigrants, people of color, low-income communities, and encourage them to go through the program. And they've now graduated over 100 leaders in that program, and most of them stay involved in one form or another. Again, I want to emphasize, though, that while a lot of communities have these kinds of formal leadership programs, the informal side is important as well. Third component is collaborative institutions. This means that there is collaboration within sectors, like the nonprofit sector, for example, but also between sectors, so that the business community is working with the nonprofit community, is working with the faith community, with government at all levels, with school districts, so that there's collaboration around particular causes or issues on a regular basis. Example is Stockton, California, which has a program called Healing South Stockton. They identified through a community health assessment a major issue facing that community being trauma, which was caused by poverty, high crime rates, and other risk factors. And so a collaboration formed of government, residents, nonprofits, schools to do asset mapping and to address the trauma systematically. I also mentioned Inclusive Dubuque, which is another example of this, and perhaps Cori will talk about that program. Fourth component is diversity and equity, embracing diversity and equity, and those are not the same. It's recognizing and celebrating the diversity of a community. Again, diversity in all forms, not just racial, but generational, renters and homeowners. Some communities tell me they're not diverse. Well, you need to look a little bit closer, because there's a lot of diversity of types of folks that are not always on the surface. A program that represents this is in Minneapolis. The Parks Department has a criteria-based funding program that every time the Parks Department looks at funding priorities, they use racial and economic factors to help drive decisions. This was started by an effort some years ago where some folks in the city government looked at number of parks per capita and identified that there was an inequity among different neighborhoods of the city, that some neighborhoods didn't have as many parks per capita as others. And so they went about creating more parks, but they found that by talking to residents didn't necessarily want more parks. They wanted parks that they could use, that are safe, that have equipment and walking paths and that kind of thing. So equity is something that you need to listen to very carefully. Fifth factor is authentic communication. This means communication not only from the city, but within different sectors. Multiple forms of communication that reach all folks. Not everybody reads the newspaper anymore. Not everybody watches TV news. Not everybody does social media. But if you use a lot of different forms of communication and provide communication in different languages, then you're more likely to reach the folks that you need to reach and provide the message that you'd like to see received. Detroit has a storyteller on staff who uses social media and videos to provide context to stories and highlight communities and stories that are often missed by the mainstream media, like in the LGBTQ community. And you know, you may feel like a lot of stories from the city that are covered by the media are negative. By having communication from the city, you can sometimes provide some context to those stories so that people see the broader issue that might be involved in that particular topic. Sixth factor is a culture of engagement, and this means that engagement is a way of life, that it's an expectation, that it's ongoing, that you don't just go to residents when you need to hear from them, but it's out there on a regular basis, and people have the ability to communicate with the city as needed whenever they're interested. Fort Collins, Colorado has a guidebook that they have departments within the city follow for engaging the community. No major decision by the city is made without consulting the community, involving the neighborhood associations that are also strengthened by the city and recognized on a regular basis, so that, again, engagement becomes an expectation and a way of life. The last factor that I'll mention is shared vision and values. Now this means that this could either be a formal vision that is in a slogan like the City of Brotherly Love, or it could be an informal set of visions and values. But when it's informal, it's reinforced by the city, so that people in the city have an optimistic view. They have pride in their neighborhood and pride in the city, and the city reinforces those factors. Think, for example, of dog control, which I used to run an animal control department, and the city has laws regarding picking up after dogs. There's no way that we can enforce that law on a daily basis, but people have accepted the value of picking up after their dogs, and that becomes a city value. A city value says that when something happens in the community that people are offended by, they say that's not what we do here. In Portland, Oregon, for example, pedestrians and bikes are given the right-of-way, and cars stop for pedestrians that are approaching a crosswalk. An example would be San Antonio, which has SA 2020, which was formed in 2010 when 6,000 people came together in a variety of ways to come up with a community strategic plan. There's over 130 nonprofits involved, businesses involved, and they created 11 goals initially that later went to 15 goals, 61 indicators that are tracked by a nonprofit now, which is tracking indicators and reporting out to the public on a regular basis. So those are the 7 components of a Civic Index that make up Civic Capital. We encourage you to use the Civic Index in your community. There's a questionnaire in the back of the booklet with 32 questions under the 7 different headings that I talked about. The Civic Index is not meant to be quantitative. it's meant to be subjective and based on perception, so that you may have different perceptions of the civic capital within a community in different parts of the community, which means that when you use the index, it's important to get a diversity of opinions and not average those opinions to come up with something in the middle. You want to respect the different opinions of different parts of the community. And so we encourage you to use the Civic Index. We are here to provide advice on the phone, or we'd be glad to come out and help facilitate meetings, or you could use local universities. We've used the Civic Index in a variety of communities up to now, and we hope that you'll find it useful, both in your All-America City applications and throughout the year.
Great, thank you, Doug. I appreciate that presentation. We did have a couple of questions come in through the chat box throughout your speech, but we will address those at the very end. And right now we're going to turn it over to the City of Dubuque, where we will be hearing from Cori and Paul. Cori, if you can go ahead and share your screen.
All right, if I succeed in technology, we'll be on our way. Okay, can you see my screen now?
I can, it looks great, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm going to take just a half a second to brag about this awesome group on the screen. Dubuque was lucky enough to head out to Denver earlier this summer and compete and be named an All-America City. And I don't say that simply because I think we're the greatest, but as Doug was talking about, the value of the National Civic League's technical support, both in the index and, maybe it's in-person support or just writing the application for this. If you're a community out there thinking about kind of, gee, I wonder where we're at, every time we've written an application, just bringing the partners around the table to check in and say, hey, how are we doing on authentic communication? How are we doing on diversity, equity, and inclusion? I think the process itself can be very helpful, and certainly you learn a lot from doing it. So what I wanted to cover today is I'm going to kind of take a two-way approach. My first goal is to help you see how you can take some of these principles from the Civic Index and really start to embed them in your community's values that Doug talked a little bit about. And when I say that, I don't just mean your city government or your county government, but really make sure that these are the values that all of the partners in the community hold if they're going to be embraced and make progress. And then I want to share just a couple of examples, because sometimes when I'm on these webinars, I feel like that's great at a 30,000 level, but how did you actually get that done? So I want to just briefly touch on a couple of those how-tos, and then my colleague Paul Zuster from the Community Foundation is going to share what I think are some of the best examples of how we're actually making this work in Dubuque. So just a little bit of a historic perspective that I think helps if you're not familiar with Dubuque. In the early 80s, we had the highest unemployment rate in the country. We had an economy that was largely based on agriculture, and two of our largest employers left the community. And so oftentimes when I tell the story of Dubuque, our story starts in that place because our community came together and said, look, we can either all get on the same page and have a similar vision that's going to take us a while to get to, or we can pack up and leave. And I think that the business community, government officials, the schools, have really come from that place of in many ways, crisis to get to the point where we are today. So the examples I share don't happen overnight, and that's another thing I would share with you is that it's really a long game when you're doing this type of work. This is a slide from a presentation the city manager gives, and we all kind of laugh at it, but I think it's very true. If you remember in Alice in Wonderland, Alice reached the fork in the road and she asked the Cheshire Cat, which way should I go from here? And the cat said, that depends on where you want to get. And Alice said, I don't care. And the cat said, well, then it doesn't really matter which way you go. And I think this is very true for communities. We have gone through, since that place in the 80s, a very strategic goal setting. And I say that in a broad sense. Our city council meets every year, and what you see here is the vision that they set for the community, that we're a sustainable and resilient city. A couple of years ago, they very intentionally added inclusive and equitable community to this statement. You can see as the statement continues the kinds of things that we expect from ourselves as we set that vision for the future. But strategic planning doesn't just happen at the city. We have gone through a very successful process in Dubuque called Envision 2010. That was actually led by our Chamber of Commerce and the Community Foundation that engaged the entire community in identifying the 10 priorities that they wanted to see done by 2010. We have a history of different organizations stepping up depending on what the purpose of the visioning process is, to engage the entire community, not just in identifying what the priorities are, but then stepping up and saying, hey, I want to be part of that solution. And I think that's really when we talk about that culture of engagement, an important part. So in 2017, we updated our comprehensive plan, our strategic plan, some communities call it. And I'll say that this was a great example of what that looks like in action. So we used, in Dubuque, we have a community engagement toolkit that we use at the city when we know we want to engage a population. We go through the exercise of saying, well, what does that mean? Do we just want their input? Do we want to co-collaborate with them to create a new process? Do we want to really empower them to find a solution to a problem they're facing where the city might just be in the background providing a little bit of support? So we went through that toolkit to identify an engagement process for our comprehensive plan. We then went through a 12-month process of community outreach to collect over 12,000 ideas from 6,000 participants. And those numbers, I think, are important, but just the breadth of that, what it takes. We're a community of 60,000 people, so to get 10% of our population engaged is something we're really proud of. We were very intentional with that process that we wanted to have a demographically representative group participating in the process. That meant that we did a lot of meeting people where they were at. We went out to every event you can imagine. We had an online app where people could submit their comments if those public meetings didn't work for them. We engaged cultural brokers to reach out to certain populations that we knew might not feel comfortable coming to the government to provide their input. And then one of the things that I thought was the most valuable is we course corrected throughout this 12 months. So at about 6 months in, we looked at our demographics and we said, we're not reaching, the elderly was one group that we were not reaching. We were not reaching our Marshallese population, which is a group that we had here from the Marshall Islands. And so we course corrected to make sure that we did some intentional outreach to those groups to get their voices included in the plan. When that plan was adopted by City Council, they very intentionally, you see the cover of the plan on your screen, it's a call to action. And so now we're in this second phase of what I would call our engagement process, where we're going out and saying, okay, we got all your ideas, that phase is over. Now we want to know which piece of this plan are you really passionate about and how can we support your leadership community to make the plan happen. So that might be working with organizations or nonprofits. It might be working with groups of residents. I think we talk a lot about partnerships at an organization level and sometimes forget that residents are partners in this work too. So we are that call to action right now, which I think is a different kind of engagement than we typically see with comp plans. But I'm really excited to see the community taking hold of this work. So what's that look like? One of the other Civic Index principles is around collaborative institutions. And what you see on the screen are some of, not all, the groups that are involved in our My Brother's Keeper initiative in the community. You see, some big institutions, our school districts, the city, some nonprofits are listed, and then groups like the Black Men's Coalition, which is a group of primarily African-American men in the community who are doing some really amazing grassroots work with our young men. On the bottom of the screen are some words that I think are actually really important to this work. because oftentimes I think we bring a group together and we think it's enough to get them in the room and say, hey, you're going to work together, and maybe we meet quarterly, but we don't feel like we're moving the needle. So for this group, they've been very intentional about that relationship building and communication piece. I think in the work that they're doing, it's very important that that trust and ability to have tough conversations is there, and that doesn't happen by accident. They have gone through a process where each of these institutions has their own strategic plan, but they have some shared priorities that they're working on. And then that last piece is the piece that doesn't always sound like the most fun, but it's really important. They have identified a set of shared performance measures and a way that they're collecting data across all of these institutions so that we can disaggregate the community indicators that we're looking at and make sure that when we move the entire community forward on third grade reading, as an example, we're making sure that all of our populations are moving forward. And so that data collection piece and getting everybody on the same page sometimes can take some time, but it's very important work to do. And then we talk about something, we actually talked about this in our application this year, the inside-outside game. And this is important for me when we talk about that embracing diversity and equity principle. And it's important because I think many of us in our communities now are saying those things are important, and we're struggling with how do we make that happen beyond starting the conversation. So for us, when we say the inside game, this is our structure for our City of Dubuque equity team. So we have a core team that kind of guides our work, and then we have within the conversation around equity, a community engagement team, recruitment and retention team that focuses primarily on our own workforce. We have a team of intercultural facilitators that train both within the organization and out in the community. And then a data team who's doing that data tracking progress. And we've just added a team that's around, we call it the cash out team. It's all the money that we put out into the community, and really looking at that as an opportunity for us as a city organization to look at, are we really putting our money where our mouth is? So I think this structure is important if you're going to do the work of equity and inclusion. And then the outside game is a group of partnerships in the community, and Paul's going to talk about Inclusive Dubuque in particular. But I think it's really important to show these things because it shows that we've got everywhere from our CEO level to our future leaders of the community and a lot of the traditionally underrepresented groups in the community, all talking about this at the same time and communicating with each other to say, here's a gap that really needs to be fixed with policy versus here's a gap that needs to be fixed by improving relationships between the city and other organizations. And then lastly, I'll just share with you this slide and the next slide because it points to something I mentioned at the beginning, and that's that this is a long game to create a culture of community engagement and improve your civic infrastructure. On this slide, you see kind of where we started, and you can see a couple of big community visioning processes that happened in the 90s and the early 2000s, and you see kind of slow progress, I would say, as we took advantage of some low-hanging fruit and some, you know, that place that I talked about in the 80s, kind of that moment of chaos in a way. And then this is, and it's not up to date, this only goes through 2013, I need to update this slide, but this is what happens when you start to be together for those slow things that can sometimes, I think to the public, when we do all that visioning, sometimes feel like a lot of process with not a lot of results. You start to see the results build on each other. And so the work on this screen is really around community engagement and sustainability. But you could do this for any topic in your community and see that each of these bubbles is led by a different group in our community that all got on the same page in the 90s and early 2000s. So with that, I want to have Paul talk about specifically that Inclusive Dubuque and equity work that I think is really something that we're very proud of in Dubuque and sharing with you all.
Great, thanks, Cori. So as a little introduction, my name is Paul Duster. I'm the Director of Community Initiatives here at the Community Foundation of Greater Dubuque. We're a little unique as far as foundations go. So obviously, most community foundations work on building funds and endowments, do grant making, but we're also a very close partner, as Cori mentioned, with the City of Dubuque and with other nonprofits, and we like to identify community needs and really help change things on a systemic level as they surface. As an example, some of the initiatives that my team's been working on in the last couple of years are things around grade level reading. Equity and inclusion has become a key component of both our work here and with the city, college access, brain health, child care. So we're involved in some pretty big issues. A couple that we're adding this year are immigration work. So we're starting to do an immigration assessment across our community. And another interesting one we started is a family caregiver center, which will be, setting up an opportunity for those who care for individuals with chronic conditions like Alzheimer's or dementia or cancer, an opportunity for those families. So we've got a pretty far-reaching impact in the community. We don't run the program, so something we want to share and be clear about is our job is to kind of convene all the stakeholders and develop unique solutions that might be out there. And then once we identify a long-term owner, whatever that entity might be, or a nonprofit or the city or the school system, we exit left. So we pride ourselves on that unique role in being able to provide that kind of oversight within our community. So that just gives you a little background on why we're engaged so deeply in some of these things. And I put together in the slides today 3 examples of things where we are reaching out into the community and working on that. But Cori, on the next slide, I want to speak a minute about authentic community engagement. And there's a lot of versions of this saying out there. This is one that I like that rings through all of the work that we do. And that is, if it's about me, without me, it's not for me. And that authentic engagement, I try to drive through all the initiatives that we're doing. And that is, it's easy to get together with all of those stakeholders and those key players and the leadership from all those areas and kind of have avoid that savior complex. We're coming in, we have all the solutions, here's the program, here's how things are going to get fixed. That we really step back and be certain that all the voices are in the room, especially those that are impacted, the ones that are most relevant. Make sure that they have input and perspective. And Cori mentioned this too, like even through the initial assessment through the city for Imagine Dubuque was, who's not at the table? Are we missing our Hispanic community, our veterans here, LGBTQ? I'll make sure that everybody is there. And it certainly, as you can understand, helps promote that buy-in to those solutions when they're part of that solution. So I just want to let you know that that's kind of an underlying rule of the things we do when we try to catch ourselves to make sure that all those voices are at the table. So I'm going to talk about 3 programs that are kind of top of mind, all different calibers and different audiences. The first one I grabbed around community engagement was one around parent engagement. So I mentioned one of the programs we do is a grade level reading program initiative, getting students to read at grade level by 3rd grade. And last year, Julie, who's pictured here, hosted parent engagement sessions. And the commentary that she included in her information was, when parents are engaged, the students perform better when they're plugged in. So she had partnered with our Multicultural Family Center in a neighborhood of our parish on the north end that has a lot of diversity represented and very unique needs. They ended up having 23 different family members participate, and these were a series of Wednesday evening sessions that ran a couple of hours. There were 6 of them over the course of the early summer once school let out. And what it did was help to teach and provide tools and resources to help these parents educate their children, but also the skills to kind of teach their own neighbors in their neighborhood. So, in itself, probably not that unique of a program, but some of the key components were Julie reached out to make sure that she was including 2 leaders. These are actually 2 women that she taught at one point in her life to become the facilitators for the session. And so these were folks from the community. They became the local representatives, and they helped put together the program topics. They helped recruit attendance for the sessions. They helped facilitate the sessions. And then what we did is, put the facility together. We provided a meal, which is always a big draw, to get attendance. Provided child care. They had, I think, 17 children that, took that barrier away that they couldn't attend that meeting unless they had childcare provided. So those, some of the key components was, again, how did we do it? Did we engage with them, or did we kind of present it to them? And certainly we went deep and engaged with it. One of the key outcomes that I was most excited about was, that's a tough pull to bring parents in on a Wednesday night through summer sessions, is they had a 90+% repeat attendance at all 6 sessions. So they kept coming back. They felt a part of that process and a part of that program. And on the last night, they reported back that the kids helped to get involved, and they created their own kind of project where they created reading calendars for the rest of the summer that they could hang up on the refrigerator. So it's just a very simple example of parent engagement, the importance that plays in grade level reading, and the importance of putting together the right sessions that became their own, and they had buy-in. So that was parent engagement. Another one I want to mention, and Cori had brought up also, is the Inclusive Dubuque program. So Inclusive Dubuque was formed back in 2012, and this came about after business leaders began to take notice of some challenges related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in Dubuque. So some large employers were drawing a much more diverse population from outside of our region. And while they might have been happy, certainly within their company, these were large employers, they were very welcoming. The other side of it was, were they feeling welcome and a sense of belonging in the community? Were they becoming part of the greater Dubuque community? Did they have a place of worship that worked for them? Shopping that was, appropriate for them? The school district was welcoming. They had recreational opportunities or restaurants. So we looked at it very holistically in the community. And through that, right now there's about 60 organizations, employers, nonprofits, school district representatives, which represent about 200 or 300 people that continue to come together to kind of address these demographic changes that are coming to our community. So Iowa and Dubuque, while we're behind the 8 ball, or behind maybe what the East and West Coast have experienced, is becoming more diverse. One of the things they did, and we're good about this, is start with that profile. So in 2015, they did a broad community equity profile, similar to what Cori had mentioned around the Imagine Dubuque. They went out and they talked to those who have lived experiences from very diverse groups. In that feedback, ours wasn't quite as impressive as Cori's, but we had 584 participants and 1,995 online surveys. So we start by doing the assessment, going out and get a feel for what are the experiences like, what are the lived experiences like, what are the challenges, the barriers, what are things are going well, where are the gaps. Out of that work then, about 90 members broke off into sector groups and put all this information into different groups around housing and safe neighborhoods, education needs, economic well-being, transportation was a sector, healthcare and health, and arts and culture. So as they found what areas were really relevant to them, that's how we kept it alive, is we have these smaller, agile sector groups, all of which have interestingly kind of morphed in different directions. As an example, the education group eventually kind of merged with the Dubuque Community School District, who was working on their 5-year strategic plan, and began to incorporate an element of diversity and inclusion in every component of their 5-year plan. The arts and culture sector group ended up merging with the City of Dubuque's master planning group to make sure that as those folks come around the table, and we continue to meet every month, does the Dubuque Museum of Art reach out to a diverse audience? Is there programming available? Is transportation available to the museum? Are there financial burdens? So it's been really deeply ingrained in these individual sectors, which has been great to see. Something we've done here at the foundation is we hired an equity coordinator, kind of oversee those sector groups and how they're moving. And then I just mentioned 2 other very important pieces that came out of that was training components. So we're in our 3rd year now, our 3rd season of a series called Best Practices in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. This was put together by a group we call the Peer Learning Council, which are primarily higher education professors, some HR representatives from large organizations, and we put together a 8-session. You come every 3rd Wednesday night for 2 hours, and this group is made up of HR representatives, diversity committee meeting members, leadership level from organizations across, again, education, corporate, nonprofit. The City of Dubuque is there. And I mean, they meet, and it's kind of, they're with their peers. So it's what's working, what's not working. We actually kicked off our third session last night, and we start with ROI, the return on investment. Why would you even consider this beyond the legal requirements, but why this is just the right thing to do, and there's also a good return from a business perspective for focusing on diversity. So the training component was one, and the other is we also created a CEO cohort, which we call our business leader equity cohort. This came about as those students graduated from that best practices series and go back to their organizations, then they would have the best intentions and programs they're ready to roll out. But if the person at the helm, if she or he, the CEO or the CFO, doesn't endorse the program, doesn't give it funding, doesn't give the employees time to work on it, then it fizzles out. So we put together this CEO cohort, and right now it's about 15 or 20 of the largest employers in Dubuque. We also have representation there from the school system, from the colleges, from Greater Dubuque Development, the economic development component. And we're talking about it at that level, which has been awesome. So again, some of these are large corporations, much further along. Others are a little smaller, like a local owned that just doesn't have diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of their overall program. And I mean, we've been meeting with them since last October. We meet every other Friday, every other month, and we're meeting again tomorrow. And the conversations have gone to how do we continue to recruit and retain a diverse workforce? Why is that good for my company? And again, how do I get it beyond? They're happy here at the community school district, or they're happy here working at John Deere, but are they engaged in the community? And that's where the Inclusive Dubuque component has certainly helped. And then finally, I have just a fun one around the Washington Neighborhood Garden. So Washington Neighborhood is in, I would say, a very established part of downtown Dubuque. It's probably, again, one of the most diverse neighborhoods in our area. One of the things we did there is we partnered with two women who live in the neighborhood to start this community garden. And they'll be the first to tell you that the garden is awesome in itself, but is certainly just the tool. It is a way to bring together the community. She said the children come through, they're in there on Sunday nights, who've never, planted anything, don't know what things might look like, fresh fruit. They gather them, they share them as part of the community. And now they're expanding out and recruiting block captains. So this is, I'll say, probably a 20 square block area. And finding other ways to engage within their own community, bringing those neighbors and kids together. They're planning right now kind of a fall harvest to share the bounty from the garden and do a potluck in the garden and across the street at the park. They do, one of the neat things they do is just a neighborhood newsletter that the two women help to craft on upcoming events and did you knows. And while they mail it out occasionally, about every other time they hand deliver these. So there's 600 houses that they'll go to the door and hand deliver. And again, that's the value in the community engagement. They said, that's where you build this credibility and trust over long periods of time, slowly over long periods of time. But they've got great traction. They've done some street mural painting. They've had cleanup weekends where we go in and help out. So again, the garden was the tool, but we talk about the Washington neighborhood like it's the community garden. And I'll just close with, we just installed one of the little free libraries down there, and they're going to do all cookbooks in it. So cookbooks for kids and cookbooks for adults. So just exciting pockets of things going on in Dubuque. And there's a few more slides on the next page, one slide, but I will leave it at that and turn it over back to you, Rebecca, for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate you sharing examples. So for now, we're going to jump into the comments and let me just, here we go. Okay, so the first one here is for Cori, and there were some questions about the community engagement cultural brokers. So we had a question about what a cultural broker was. Is it just a representative from the community? And then sort of a follow-up question is, do you compensate the cultural brokers when they help you to reach into the community?
Yeah, great question. Yes, we found that with some of the populations that we wanted to reach out to, we, you know, we could send them the invitation to the meeting. We could even say we want to do a specific meeting for your group, but there was no trust or relationship established between the city and those groups, and so they would not respond. And so we have been able to reach out to folks in the community. Sometimes it's, you know, we've had great luck with religious institutions, with pastors or another trusted leader through that community. We have been able to reach out in some instances through our community health center to populations that are using those services and find a social worker or someone else who can make the initial connection for us. They do a few things. One is they make the introduction and kind of, you know, help provide that safe space. Sometimes they have been really great in coaching us as we set up a meeting and say, hey, you know, this group is not going to feel comfortable talking about that in a group. What about one-on-one meetings, or providing translation services, or just kind of thinking through what's going to make a comfortable interaction with those groups. Oftentimes in the past, I think they've been the people who have been the voice of the community. So in the Marshallese population example, for many years, we just went to that pastor and expected him to speak on behalf of the whole community, and that is not a fair assessment. And so we've been trying to build those relationships on our own. We have, with our larger projects, been able to offer some compensation, whether it's gift cards or actually paying folks. As Paul mentioned, we always try and provide just like the logistics things, the food and those types of resources. But where possible, yes, we are trying to have gift cards available. Just the logistics thing, I learned we were trying to pay people and somebody said, well, then they have to count it as income and there's a whole nother process you have to go through. So sometimes gift cards or things like that are easier so that people don't have to worry about reporting that. But yes, we're trying to compensate people when they're helping us.
Great. Sounds like those gift cards are a good workaround so that you don't have to mess with counting that as income on your tax returns and all that good stuff. Good idea. Doug, this next question is for you. Someone asked if you could give a little bit more information on the facilitation process of the Civic Index. Specifically, who do you recommend facilitates the Civic Index, and what might a facilitation process look like?
Sure. Probably the biggest decision is who is the convener, and we suggest having a neutral convener, maybe a local university or college, or could be a school, could be a United Way agency or community foundation like in Dubuque. So having a neutral convener, I think, is very important. Small groups is essential. So if you're doing only one big session, break it down into small groups. Preferred would be to go out to the various parts of the community, because not everybody wants to come to a meeting typically that you might designate at a particular time and place. So if you're able to take this out in the field and go to perhaps a church after service and perhaps even use someone from that organization to do the facilitation, you could certainly do a train the trainer practice program where you train community folks to facilitate meetings that might happen throughout the community.
Great, thanks for that information. I think that is very key, is finding a way to go out into the community and do those facilitations in spaces that are a little bit more accessible to those parts of the population that we don't always engage. Let's see, Cori, I'm going to come back to you for this one. Had a question about your internal engagement teams and how those staff were established. Were they nominated? Did they apply? Is it voluntary?
Yeah, awesome question. So we actually just restructured these. We have had most of those teams functional for, I would say, anywhere from 3 to 6 years, depending on, we kind of start one team at a time to get it going. When we first established them, it was largely folks who raised their hand and said, hey, I'm interested in the topic in some way, which was awesome. I think that's a great way to start because you have that personal commitment, and a lot of that work while you're working on the structure of the organization is also personal work. And so to have people who are kind of in tune to that is very important. So we actually just this summer kind of started with a fresh slate for all of our teams and did an organization-wide application process. And I think that that was really important. We're actually doing this with all of our teams across the city organization based on the results. We tend to see the folks that are maybe in a management position or are in the departments that we interact with a lot, and so they get picked all the time. And we don't necessarily see maybe some of our frontline staff that are really interested in the topic that don't get the chance to do this kind of work. And their voices are really important because if you only have managers at the table, you're missing, some of our greatest trainers are police officers and firefighters and frontline public works staff who interact with the public every day. So we had an application process, and it was very simple. It was, a couple questions about why you think equity work is important and what you think you can bring to a team. So there wasn't a right or a wrong answer, but it just challenged people to think through it a little bit. And we ended up with a ton of new folks on those teams that we would not have picked if we were going out and asking people to participate. So I think it was good to work with the willing to begin with to get you started. But I think if you can engage folks that you don't normally hear from, it's very valuable.
Great. And we just had a follow-up question to that come in on those internal teams. Do they receive any sort of compensation or stipend for their participation?
They do not, but something that I have, I wouldn't say compensation, but they do get access to a lot of training opportunities. We send them to conferences, and for a lot of these people, I will say that, if you ask your staff what motivates them, I'm a person who give me opportunities to grow myself, give me those opportunities, and a lot of these folks are those people. So I think that that's motivation and compensation for a lot of them. We were also very upfront in the application process. We said, if you participate in this team, it's expected that you'll spend 30 hours over the course of the year doing this work. And we were very clear with their supervisors that this is part of their work. As an organization, we need every department engaged in doing the work of equity. And so it's not hours that should be above and beyond their normal workload. This should be part of what they're doing. And so we ask and we appreciate that their supervisors support them in doing that.
Absolutely. And I think you're 100% right in that continuing education and conference opportunities can be super motivating for the right types of employees. Now, yeah. Paul, I have a question here for you. The question is, do you provide funding for the creation of the community garden that you mentioned?
That's a great question. It's kind of a unique answer. I wasn't here when they started it, but essentially the garden was an empty lot next to a building that has a neighborhood tool lending library. So he donates the space, is my understanding, for the actual land. And it fits well with their mission, right, with supporting the neighborhood. So it's a vacant lot. We engaged with the two women when we contracted with them. We actually contracted with them for the year and through a grant. And it's kind of a stipend payment, but they help work the garden, help coordinate the community events. So that would be the only money out of pocket. We do provide some support with insurance, having their garden under some of the work that we do through here in our insurance. But other than that, I mean, the two women go out and recruit. So they have worked with the city on some funding, some smaller amounts to offset the cost of the newsletters and buy tools. And they work really closely with like local hardware stores and our Lowe's to get tools and seeds at discounted prices. But again, the key was, I think the land is kind of donated for now. And so you're always at the mercy of, you know, they're not pulling the plug on that, but they've really built it out.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for that. Yes, definitely. I think that answers the question. I believe we've addressed everything here in the chat box. If I missed a question or if you think of something later, feel free to email me at Rebecca, REBECCAT, @ncl.org, and I'll be able to reach out to our presenters and get any of last-minute questions answered. With that, I just want to thank everyone for joining us on today's webinar. A special thank you goes out to Doug, Cori, and Paul for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us here today. We really appreciate that. I will be sending a follow-up email with a recording of today's webinar, as well as the slides and some additional resources. Included in that email is also going to be a brief survey that will help us to gauge the success of our webinars, as well as get ideas for future webinars. So I think it's about 3 questions. If you can take a time to give us some feedback on that. Also, we hope that you will join us for our October webinar, where we will be discussing leadership academies from ordinary to extraordinary. On that call, we will be joined by the City of El Paso and the City of Wichita, so it should be a good one. And again, I'll have registration information for you in my follow-up email. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.